Rise now, ye white whale. Show us your crooked jaw. Show us your wrinkled brow. Rise. The birds. The birds! He rises!
Can you pull in Leviathan with a fishhook or tie down its tongue with a rope? Can you put a cord through its nose or pierce its jaw with a hook? Will it keep begging you for mercy? Will it speak to you with gentle words? Will it make an agreement with you for you to take it as your slave for life? Can you make a pet of it like a bird, or put it on a leash for the young women in your house? Will traders barter for it? Will they divide it up among the merchants? Can you fill its hide with harpoons, or its head with fishing spears? If you lay a hand on it, you will remember the struggle and never do it again. Any hope of subduing it is false. The mere sight of it is overpowering. No one is fierce enough to rouse it. Who then is able to stand against me?
How complexity can arise out of nothing is a quandary that has fascinated me since I was a child. It all started when I was introduced to the concept of evolution. Not in science class, but in Sunday school. As you can imagine, the idea was imparted with incredulity and scorn, pushing me via my immature logic to lead me to conclude that a complex world must arise from a complex cause. This sort of logic was passed around intelligent design circles for a number of years, and I toyed with it myself as I wrestled with my understanding of the natural world. However, looking back, I realize now that I had a nagging sense of something not being quite right. As I matured, I began to understand the sheer scale of the world, both in time and space. And when I started to grasp that, the idea of tiny residual changes trickling down and emerging into a complex web of traits made intuitive sense to me. My continued interest in complexity led me to read with similar vigor on other topics: politics, economics, history, archetypes, literature, psychology. In every field I dipped into, I found a recurring theme: how simple, random collections of actors can, when interacting, organically evolve into a complex system. We can simulate, but never perfectly. We can study economies and evolutionary patterns with mathematical equations, but no equation can tell us the future. Once you start to wrap your head around this self-apparent paradox, a lot of truths fall into place. And one truth in particular of special relevance for this essay is, some systems will forever be uncontrollable. This doesn't vibe well with the human instinct to wrestle for dominion. At one point in history, when our knowledge of science was accelerating at breakneck speed, people suspected that humanity might one day conquer the universe, become gods. But now, with new understandings of quantum physics, scientists have become increasingly persuaded that unpredictability and chaos are rules, and the extent that we can shape our world is finite. This does not mean that humanity can't change things; it already has in significant ways. But it means the expectations of futurists, dictators, and utopians are now in question. Complex systems. What do tradition, capitalism, evolution, and democracy have in common? Society, the economy, biology, and politics are all complex adaptive systems, sometimes also called fractal systems. A fractal system is a complex, nonlinear, unpredictable system composed of many agents or individuals. Every agent in the system has some agency and autonomy, with each making decisions or otherwise acting along simple, similar rules, as well as interacting with one another. Because of the scale of activity and interactions, and because of the autonomy and diversity of the agents, fractal systems over time generate emergent properties, traits that are not found in any individual agent but only arise when the system is working as a whole. That's what makes them nonlinear. The output is more and different than the input. Fractal systems are in a continual state of flux, far from a state of equilibrium, with energy constantly moving in and out of the system. As the agents within it respond to each other and their environment, they organically self-organize until they reach a state of efficiency that is suboptimal, that is, it works good enough. To accomplish this, complex adaptive systems persistently exist at what's called the edge of chaos, a creative, responsive state between the stagnation of equilibrium and dysfunction of chaos. Complex adaptive systems organizationally trend to self-similarity. That means when you zoom in or zoom out on any branch of the system, the parts look similar to the whole. If you consider an economy, for example, a family-owned corner store's operation contains patterns of commerce that mirror the patterns in an economic system as a whole. Smaller mini-systems are nested inside the larger system. This is what makes the system fractal, and why even small iterations in just a part of a complex system can have significant feedback effects that affect everything. Why can't we control complex adaptive systems? Why can't we replace the randomness and capriciousness of these systems with a professionally planned, intentionally organized system, made by people who know what they're doing? Throughout history, many have tried. Totalitarian governments, communes, utopian societies, and eugenicists have attempted to seize and direct these systems in a way they saw fit, for a variety of reasons. However, they encountered a consistent problem. Professionally planned systems become inefficient and, in many cases, completely collapse. Economists discovered this truth a while ago. Ludwig von Mises and later Friedrich Hayek canonized the observation and coined it the economic calculation problem, the fact that planned economies inevitably lead to inefficient allocation of resources. This, in turn, is related to the local knowledge problem, the fact that knowledge about needs in an economic system is distributed among the many individuals within the economy, making it impossible for one person to ever know all that's needed. These limitations are applicable to all complex adaptive systems. Relevant knowledge is distributed among the agents. No one agent can more effectively gather that knowledge on their own. There's other impossible commodities in these systems as well. Complex adaptive systems develop over long periods of time and over multiple iterations. They have selection processes that naturally weed out inefficiencies and dysfunctions. They exist at a massive scale. Our attempts at simulating or creating these systems is limited by our inability to manipulate time, predict selection, and manage real-world scale. Let's walk through some of these complex adaptive systems that we deal with in the everyday, and consider how these limitations make them impossible to control. Market and command economies. Across the globe, raw materials, goods, resources, skills, and land are unevenly distributed between populations of people who want them. Societies at both the micro and macro level began to solve this problem with currency, trade, and markets. Agricultural and then developing urban centers developed systems that responded to supply and demand, where individuals worked to produce goods, hired workers to assist, sold goods to others, specialized their skill set, and so on and so forth. Though at the smallest level they involve two individuals trading goods and currency, the market is a massive, sprawling, organic, and complex system that is always on the move. Demand increases or dries up. Supplies expand or bottleneck. Prices and inflation fluctuate. As agents within the economy adapt to new circumstances, economies dip and then recover. As technology and social sciences advance, many lament the inherent inequality of the natural market economy. As with all systems, only a few end up with the largest share of wealth, and it takes a huge catastrophe before the top 10% are truly toppled. The wealthiest live a life of privilege, while the hard-working underclass struggle to make ends meet. No one wants to be the one at the bottom of the pile, and everyone has some sympathy for the plight of the economically deprived. Elaborate safety nets and welfare programs have been developed by governments to alleviate this issue. However, some suggest the problem cannot be solved by such means, because the system itself is the problem. Capitalism, the derogatory term for a free market economy, creates inequality through its reckless self-interest, its chaos, its outcomes. The invisible hand of the market is a capricious and cruel god, undeserving of our worship. We should cast off this system, recreate it in our own image, design the economy in a manner much more efficient and fair than this randomness can ever be. Central planning can fix the hiccups, errors, and crashes that inevitably occur on Wall Street. This sounds on its surface like a great idea. Who wouldn't want a market managed by a team of economic experts who know what policies should be enforced, what resources should be produced, and where to send them, what items should cost, what wages workers should be paid? Central planning ought to make things better, but it doesn't. Central planning at worst is an unmitigated disaster which leads to shortages, economic failure, and the starvation of millions. At best, it hobbles along for a few years before grinding the system down to such inefficiency that the planners have no choice but to give up. Central planning doesn't work. Or in the places where it sort of does, it's nowhere near as efficient as a free market. For one, an economy is simply too massive, too complex, and too unstable to ever fully control. There's too many moving parts, and that all boils down to the information problem. There's no way to know enough about consumer need and demand to ever plan these things ahead. Free market economies empower the individual agents to use their subjective values to determine the appropriate supplies, demands, and prices. In a sense, the information about who needs what is crowdsourced. As needs change, customers change, and the market dynamically responds. Central planning can't access that information quickly enough or accurately enough, nor is it as sensitive or capable of rapid change. It's too rigid. The free market is chaotic, but at least it's fluid enough to change course when it hits a wall. Democracy and totalitarianism. Democracy has become, in some circles, a bit of a dirty word, but I'd like to field a brief defense. Like any political strategy, democracy, or in other words, the dispersion of political decision-making, isn't perfect. However, we must imagine the nation and all its constituents as a fundamentally chaotic system, in a constant state of shifting and changing. The needs and wants of the population are always on the move. The dream of the total dictatorship is to give absolute power to one or a few individuals who can make all the major decisions about how the polity should be run. Certainly this top-down ordering of a political system works more quickly than the sluggish pace we find in a democratic system. Decisions are made unilaterally, without all the pesky arguing. On the other hand, though, inefficiencies are sure to come. A single person or group cannot possess all the knowledge needed for state building, especially in a complex system where the needs are different moment to moment. The best you can hope to do is poll the citizenry, which is inefficient, time-consuming, and inherently flawed, or appoint delegates to manage smaller sections of the state, thereby diluting one's absolute power and gradually becoming more of a republic. Having strong state leadership seems important in all nations. Without someone possessing the vision, direction, and final say, some states end up floundering. But ultimately, no dictator, no matter how well-educated or wise, can solve the problem of running a state. The macro and micro decisions that make up the complex system of governance are much more effectively made at the ballot box, through elected representatives, through democratic engagements. Specialized decisions can still be made by those brought into the hierarchy, but by receiving direct input from the people, democratic systems are better suited to responding to ever-fluctuating demands. Evolution and eugenics. In the natural world, we can see many of the same patterns and problems as in other systems. It is in nature that we have the concepts of natural selection, evolution, and adaptation, all of which apply to complex systems even outside of nature. As evolutionary agents adapt to their environment and interact with surrounding organisms over the course of many generations, the mechanisms that functioned well enough to allow survival were perpetuated. Competition allowed these mechanisms to be refined, and patterns gradually emerged as a consequence. Even though there's no direct planning involved, at least as far as the science has to say, selection is effective in driving and duplicating the changes that work. This has produced immensely complex forms of life out of seemingly nothing. Eugenicists and scientists of the past, upon learning of natural selection and the potential for human life to change, have in various ways sought to tinker with the human evolutionary path. For one, they thought they might direct human evolution to improve humanity's gene pool by encouraging the fit to breed and sterilizing the unfit. Others adopted more bold and more controversial approaches, via ideas of social Darwinism or racial classifications, believing certain groups were, quote-unquote, more evolved or better suited for the future. Eugenics at its most basic form isn't crazy. Humans have used artificial selection to domesticate animals and plants for generations, and we certainly see that as civilization has changed, so too have the traits people seek out in partners. Human evolution hasn't stopped, and we have some choice in the matter. But like other complex systems, this idea of planning out and guiding evolution falls apart the more you analyze it. A fundamental misunderstanding that undergirds eugenics is the erroneous assumption of fitness, meaning objective superiority. In evolution, fitness is dictated by survival and continuation, not by a species' complexity, strength, intelligence, or so on. A human being is not evolutionarily more fit than a bacterium. An organism's ability to survive and perpetuate is based highly on the fitness within their context, within a specific environment. Different species fare better in different environments. Furthermore, all traits, no matter how intrinsically we think of them as good, have trade-offs. Complexity is a good example here. We often think of complex animals as superior to simple ones. However, simple organisms have advantages that complex ones don't. Single-celled life can exist in extreme environments where no complex creature can ever hope to survive, because their energy needs are so basic. Complexity comes at a cost of higher maintenance. With that in mind, then, it becomes impossible to decide which traits humans ought to have. Is breeding ourselves into a higher IQ ceiling worth it, or has selection capped our intelligence at a certain point for a legitimate cost concern? Should humans be stronger, faster, more beautiful? Who gets to decide? What if we breed out those traits that we don't like, and those traits end up being necessary in the distant future? What if eugenics flattens our variety that we need to ensure the survival of our descendants? Evolution has the advantage of lots of time, and lots of trial and error. Over millions of years, it has reached different states of stability in a complex system. Humans don't have access to all that time, and all those real-life experiments. We can't possibly know all the information, or know what the future holds. The best we can do is guess. This limitation also creates problems for transhumanism. The brain and the human body are complex adaptive systems in themselves, having evolved and been selected for over millions of years of evolution. To this day, the reactions and behavior of the human brain are wholly unpredictable. Neuroscientists are coming to the conclusion that the brain is a chaotic system, and if that's true, that does not bode well for the predictions of transhumanists who wish for artificial brains to reach equivalence with biological ones. The human brain may never be sufficiently recreated. We may never have simulated mechanical bodies that ever reach the same efficiency as organic ones. Furthermore, if we were to submit our organic selves to machine learning and adaptation, there's no guarantee that artificial intelligence will ever be able to compete with the efficiency of natural selection. In all probability, it will be a downgrade. But let's be clear, eugenics does not refer to everything. Individuals making choice is not eugenics. Mate selection for fitness, suitability, and merit is not eugenics. Augmentations are not eugenics. Researching the diagnosis and cure of genetic diseases is not eugenics. Developing better prosthetics is not eugenics. Chaotic systems can respond to agency and choice organically. However, there will never be an individual, corporation, or elite scientific team who can design the perfect human, or ever fully compete with natural selection in the creation of adaptable life. Evolution will always be more efficient. Tradition and social engineering. If you look through America's history, you will find it dotted with various utopian societies. The freedom afforded American citizens made the landscape ripe for this sort of experimentation. Different Christian or religious groups Political ideologies and thinkers bought land, invited residents to a social order, and founded farms, communes, and the like to try out new ways of living. But these societies don't last. Only a very small number lasted more than a generation, and 1 or 2 persist to today. The rest fell apart as squabbling, demographic changes, or leadership led to splits and abandonment. To this day, people continue to try and design the perfect society, pondering the structure and order of their perfect culture, and how they might live it out. Most of these dreamers want to shake off the rigid customs of old and go in with radical, fresh direction. Perhaps this is the most intuitively reasonable suggestion. Societies are made by people, after all. Society is literally a social construct. Why shouldn't we be able to sit down, reorder it to our liking, and design a society better fit for our needs? Why not throw out all those unnecessary, outdated traditions and invent new ones? Yet the proposition of making a society, of social engineering, of designing a human culture out of the ether, has proved thorny. Artificially designed societies are prone to fast and sometimes catastrophic collapse. Utopian communities easily become cults, and cults become dysfunctional and destructive. Subcultures rise and fall with relative ease, with little meat to their bones. Traditional communities fare better than experimental ones. What you might malign as stagnant and old-fashioned helps various cultures around the world continue for thousands of years, surviving calamity, war, and displacement. How can this be? How come a human society, something that must be made by people, be so difficult to put together? Part of the issue is we have a perspective bias. It isn't that humans cannot create culture, of course they do. However, most cultures fail, then vanish without a trace. Most traditions that ever existed we've never heard of, just as most organisms that have lived on this planet have never been fossilized. The cultures we see today, their traditions, languages, and customs, survived the test of time, and therefore must have traits that allowed for this survival. This is the law of selection at work. At the same time, there are challenges to artificially forcing a society to assemble rather than permitting one to grow slowly and organically. Culture and tradition are the emergent patterns of a complex adaptive system, and you cannot force emergent patterns onto a system in a top-down fashion. Just like an economy or evolution or polity, you have to allow agency, so that interactions and decisions accumulate. People have to share knowledge freely to create knowledge. This is really what tradition does. It is a means of communicating ideas and wisdom between generations of people who otherwise can't stay in contact. A direct line to your ancestors and descendants that can survive even when you die. As a technology, it's ingenious. It doesn't require writing or documentation, and it is captured in digestible images, symbols, physical ceremonies, and so on. You can think of following tradition as tapping into the shared wisdom of everyone who came before you. Put crudely, it's generationally crowdsourced. This level of emergence is difficult to accomplish in an engineered culture. Another issue lies in the information problem once again. Consider Chesterton's fence. If a man is walking through his land and spots a fence built by someone else, he could look at the fence and say, "This fence is old and useless, I should tear it down." But he might also say, "Whoever put this here must have done it for a reason. I'd better be sure what it's for before I make any changes." Tradition and customs are practices that contain information that has been lost to time. All the information is diffused through generations of people who aren't around anymore. We don't always know why traditions began, but they can still perform important functions, even when performed reflexively. You might be able to remove it and do something else, but you also might be damaging something crucial to human flourishing in the process. Homogeneity. Up to this point, the examples I've given of dysfunctional systemic approaches represent centralizing, totalizing strategies. Forced, imposed hierarchy. However, there's another way one can go wrong. If the totalizing strategies result in over-rigidity, at the other end of the spectrum we see the fruits of deconstruction and homogeneity. In multicellular life forms, evolution pushes cells to differentiate in function. In markets, capitalism pushes industries to specialize and diversify. In cultures, traditionalism creates elaborate hierarchies and power structures. Fractal systems inherently generate non-equilibria. In a sense, they must. Equilibrium in biological terms is death. Life is the state of sustaining oneself out of homogeneity with one's surroundings. This constant flux and flow, this heterogeneous distribution of qualities and output, is definitional for any system made up of living agents. This is why the Pareto distribution is so common. Inequality is the natural result of a complex system. Consider then attempts people make at flattening, in other words, homogenizing, systems. Revolutionaries want to flatten hierarchies imposed by tradition. Certain strains of Marxists want to flatten production and corporate structure. Others want to establish what would essentially be a direct democracy, eliminating political structures. But homogeny isn't just a political idea, it can occur as a result of technological shifts too. In genetics, for example, we are seeing a flattening of mate selection because of reliable birth control and the open sexual market that it allows. Let me give you a concrete example of the consequences of equilibrium. If democracy is so good and so much more efficient than tyranny, why don't we have democracy in the workplace? It's a worthy question. We can certainly imagine the dysfunction that can arise from a tyrannical, micromanaging CEO who dictates all decisions. The information distribution problem remains, and an efficient CEO would delegate and recognize how each department must have some autonomy to lead to better efficiency. However, it is a flawed leap of logic to conclude that therefore the CEO is a useless position and every employee should be equal shareholders and decision makers within the company, to turn every company into a co-op. There is a difference between democratic republics and direct democracies. The former allows for hierarchies and structures to develop. The latter prevents hierarchies from forming at all. This is important because hierarchy is more efficient than chaos. The fractal system must be allowed to develop and form into a natural, organic, differentiated structure. Just as laughable as it is to suggest that we can control every cell in our body, we cannot expect all our cells to do the same work and create the same output. We do not define the health of an organism by whether all of its cells are of equitable size or are receiving the same amount of energy. Likewise, a corporation is not defined as effective by how equally every employee is paid. It is defined by how well it sustains itself by creating goods and services, by attracting motivated and skilled employees, organizing itself into an efficient and specialized structure, and increasing profit margins for their stakeholders. If any of these parts fail, the corporation must adapt or die. The problem with direct democracy ultimately is not that people have the right to make the wrong decisions. It is that they are forced to make decisions, even outside of their knowledge, experience, or expertise. The wisdom of crowds isn't due to some alchemy by which a crowd becomes intelligent. It is because crowds self-sort, and those who know more naturally flow into prominence. Hierarchies naturally form to deal with the problems of specialized knowledge, but these programs of enforced equality suppress hierarchy emergence. In other words, forced equality is just as bad as forced hierarchy. The imposition of roles in either direction, oppression from above or suppression from below, binds up the processes that make these organic systems work. Chaining the beast. Given the picture I've painted of complex adaptive systems, it is worth asking, so what? It might seem I'm arguing there's no point in trying to control anything, as these systems will only malfunction if you try. However, there are some principles from these systems that can help us not only deal with them, but help us avoid common mistakes. By understanding the complexities better, we can approach these systems more wisely. To best maintain the integrity and continuation of efficient systems, we should do the following. Increase agency. The more able each agent in a system is to make choices to their own benefit, the better the system will flow. Maintain rules. Complex systems work best when every agent has simple rules to follow and when those rules are fairly applied. Inconsistent, complicated, or unreasonable rules cause the relationships to break down. Anticipate emergence, including unintended consequences. Know that when a complex system is working naturally, it will cause emergent properties that are not present within individual agents. Know that input does not necessarily translate to output, and that sometimes minor changes to input can have huge unplanned effects. Adapt. Be on the lookout for changes on the horizon or at your feet, and be willing to shift gears when necessary. Show restraint and patience. At the same time, don't make sudden changes without proper planning or investigation. Don't change for change's sake. Also be patient when changes are made, because it may take a while for the results to fully mature. Diversify. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't throw all your hopes into one policy, politician, product, or idea. Keep options open and have secondary plans in place in case of failure. Specialize and delegate. Find and invest in people with particular skills. Split large systems into branches with delegated leadership so that differentiation can occur. Trust those with skills with what they know best. Be humble. Ultimately, no single person or entity can know everything or control entire complex systems. No matter how much knowledge you may accrue, there will always be more to know and mistakes to be made. Rather than charging forward arrogantly, listen to those who came before you. Heed the advice of others, and consider the many branching possibilities of the future. I hope this has helped you think through the ways complexity manifests in everyday life. Let me know if there are other complex systems you interact with, and how these lessons might impact your understanding of them.